All right, let's go ahead and get started. Today's lecture may be relatively short. We're kind of transitioning between topics as we finish up this topic on physical security and move on to social engineering. There's not a real clear connection between the two, so we'll pick up on the next topic after Thursday's quiz. Where we left off last week is we were talking to some extent about how even in this context where we think of all these sort of virtualized or sort of remotely accessible services, how ultimately underneath the hood there is some physical computing infrastructure that is relevant for us. And then even as we think of more and more of our workloads being housed in some massive data center off in the middle of nowhere, there is still really what is ultimately sort of physical security considerations for that, for sort of the physical structure that is housing the data center, as well as for all sorts of mechanisms that are available to do remote data center infrastructure management. That type and that class of software in and of itself has turned out to be potentially an enticing target in terms of people want the ability to remotely access and maintain these things, and that becomes a potential target. And then actually just the physical infrastructure itself is itself either a target or a point of weakness or vulnerability in the resulting system. And this data center scale infrastructure has historically and can be at the risk of catastrophic failure due to all sorts of weather and other related phenomenon. There's all sorts of scenarios. I picked just 3 random examples, and we can take a look at some of them. But it does turn out that if there is a fire or a flood or some other natural disaster happening in a particular location, could be quite far away from where we are physically located due to the kind of the interconnected nature of all these services. There can be massive outages that can last for hours or sometimes even days here. This is just one example, and you can follow the links directly in the slides of massive flooding in New York City that happened from Hurricane Sandy a number of years ago, and how that really hobbled a number of data centers that happened to be located in a place that was thought to be sort of immune to anything other than 100-year plus floods, but those things do happen every so often, and so there was those issues related to it. Pretty well-known sort of massive cloud data center fire in Europe that brought down a large number of services in Europe for a period of days. More closer to home, a water main break in Des Moines this past summer took down a whole bunch of services across all of Iowa, including 911 stopped working for a period of time. And that was just an office building in the middle of downtown Des Moines, and there was a water main, there was a flood, and Lumen Technologies was housing some critical equipment there. It took them several days to even get sort of fundamental service back up and running here. Now, okay, things happen, there's natural disasters, there's these phenomena. One take would be that even when we think of these things as being the sort of virtual infrastructure, these remotely accessible computers, these virtualized or emulated architectures that we're remotely connecting to, underneath there is something physical at the end of the day. And so that concern about how we protect physical access to even things like data centers from not just malicious people who are looking to gain access, but just from natural disasters and phenomena of that nature is a pretty critical consideration. The internet itself, right? We think of this as being this kind of thing that exists and that we have access to, and when it works, it's fine, and when it doesn't work, it's oftentimes something on our end that is the problem. Outside of your organization, right? Once you go outside your own kind of self-controlled sort of LAN, your internal network, there is, to some extent, by design, less control of how information flows from point to point across the internet. But there's some physical vulnerabilities associated with that as well. We oftentimes don't think, in my opinion, of the internet as being a physical thing. It's thought of more as like an organizational approach to communication, but the internet's a very much physical thing. Finding modern versions of these maps are a little bit difficult. Depends on what you're really trying to measure. You'll get a fundamentally different kind of map. But certainly there's concerns regarding potential physical disruption of the various edges shown in this map here, as well as potentially wiretapping or some sort of monitoring of data occurring across those edges in the internet. This is a map of the US internet backbone circa 2017. Now we're getting to the point with sort of broadband availability, it becomes a little bit harder to really depict what is internet backbone versus just more broadly available fiber network connections across the US. there's all sorts of people who attempt to kind of collect and try to measure that topology. So here is one. This is just a pretty mediocre visualization here. That it takes different data sets that are provided for various either historical or current layouts of internet backbone. So if you want to look at 1969 ARPANET and then how it kind of advanced over the years, that's going to end relatively quickly, though. Yeah, 1972 version of it. There was also a map of the Iowa fiber backbone. It's not a very good map, though, so I'll bring it up again here just to get something a little bit closer to home. There's our Iowa statewide fiber map, and there we go, where there's a bunch of blobs in the middle of the continental United States. One that's maybe a little bit more interesting is there's just direct layout of broadband availability in the state of Iowa. Generally, when you look at these maps, they also just tend to roughly map to population centers as well. So broadband availability is effectively localized where people are localized, but you can actually explore further in this map and see the various providers and where there's general lack of availability across the state of Iowa. Some of these are kind of crossing major highways as well, in which there's effectively broadband cellular availability. But you see the clusters, you can actually look at where the major towns are in Iowa based on that broadband availability here. And then actual the submarine cable map. This is a pretty cool website. There's not a whole ton of data beyond what I was already showing in the prior map, but this is meant to be specifically those cables that are undersea, that are attempting to do kind of intercontinental from country to country connections. And again, not only is this sort of a physical thing here, it's also a very sort of tractable, quantifiable thing. I guess what I'm trying to get at, that you're trying to access some service in Europe. You have some web application. You're here in Iowa. You are trying to access this location in Europe. We do that trace route. We know that there's a number of hops that we're getting from where we are here, located in Ames, Iowa, to get to the backplane, effectively to get out of the country at some point. Ultimately, though, when we're leaving the US and making our way to Europe to send data back and forth, it's not 10,000 different paths it's potentially taking at that point. It's a dozen. And to me, that's kind of an interesting thing. I don't actually know exactly in terms of GPS coordinates entirely how accurate those cable depictions are. I think they're just meant to be roughly accurate and not quite so accurate. But in terms of how our traffic is going to get to from, say, New York to Europe, it's going to go over one of those cables. And calling it a single cable is a little misleading. It's a singular connection, but effectively it's taking that path laid down on the seafloor over the Atlantic Ocean, effectively. So when something happens to one of those lines, and things can happen to one of those lines, there is some capacity to kind of reroute traffic, right? There's not just one single point of failure, but the internet's a very physical thing. It is a number of these sort of physical interconnections between these various points of ingress and egress on a sort of country by country basis here. Also, I didn't realize this, and the map doesn't let me zoom in that much. This is a website focused entirely on undersea cables, so be it. And there's internet cables from Chicago to Lower Peninsula of Michigan. I didn't realize that. So it's kind of cool to see. Depending on what kind of traffic you're accessing, you may be actually crossing Lake Michigan or not. I never realized that was the case, and I don't know how common knowledge it is or how frequently such connections are used here. That risk of either wiretapping of those undersea cables or just actual physical disruption of those undersea cables and resulting internet infrastructure is not a theoretical risk. It's both a theoretical risk and an actual in practice risk. This article talks about how, not believed to be malicious, there was an actual ship that was sinking, and 3 undersea cables were damaged in the Red Sea due to a sinking ship and the actual anchor of that ship. Again, this is a very physical thing, falling down. Feels like bad luck to me that as the anchor fell down, it happened to hit those particular cables. Um, I'm not a geography whiz. I was trying to look at this before and trying to determine, exactly what cables they were talking about here, and it's not that clear, or maybe there's some additional information that's not being shown somewhere in this region, and because this article talks about the Red Sea cable, and between Asia, Africa, and Europe. So somewhere in this particular map, there's some cables that got damaged as part of this. The article doesn't say. It may not be something where they specifically would announce particularly which cables would have been damaged. There's certainly concern as a part of active war that there may be a desire to damage, amongst other infrastructure, to damage internet infrastructure as well. I guess damaging cyber and physical infrastructure is kind of a dual, two-edged sword there, right? As we see pipelines get destroyed and things like that, it kind of tends to damage both parties. But there could be certain undersea cables that could be perceived as more valuable to one side of a conflict versus another. Those are now, I guess, considered a valid target, or certainly a potential target in actual warfare itself. And then separate from actually destroying the cables is the idea of surveillance of undersea cables. And when you read about these leaks from the NSA or other state agencies, I guess you pretty much have to take them at face value. We don't truly know the truth of these scenarios of what's actually happening in practice. But this was back, via part of sort of the Snowden leaks here, where it was pretty much shown. At least there was slide decks and other documentation strongly implying that the NSA had the capacity to kind of tap into all those undersea cables. And when you have access to that, then you basically have access to the entire internet's data stream. At the time, it wasn't clear to me, if they would really have the capacity, whether to tap into that and to do any sort of large-scale collection of that traffic. Still not clear to me that actual collection of all that raw traffic is possible, but they maybe wouldn't want to or need to do that. It would be more sort of targeted collection. So having the capacity to tap into those cables kind of gives a reason to believe that we don't necessarily should have a lot of trust of that traffic that's heading over the internet, or at least that it can be intercepted at various points along the way. So we have these physical internet, we have these physical data servers, and then when we talk about physical security, it's not just things like our USB ports on our computers. It then also has to do with sort of the physical access to these facilities themselves. So at the very least, we need locks and locked doors as kind of a critical need. But the thought is that it's beyond just needing something for the front door of the facility and the server room. As we saw a couple of those examples from last Thursday, kind of auxiliary rooms also potentially need to be locked down, because in modern buildings, there tends to be multiple kind of hidden paths from one point to another. This is a fun kind of plot in Mr. Robot Season 1, where they get into a custodial closet and they override kind of the HVAC control to kind of cause the building to, well, it's a little silly at that point, to kind of melt down the storage tapes that are stored in that facility. Locks are separate and complementary to other physical access measures. One thing that our textbook talks to some extent about is this concept of a man trap, I'd call that an awkward term for a small space with sort of two sets of locking doors, meaning you have to give access to get into this kind of self-contained space, and then be given separate access to leave that self-contained space. I don't think there's any of those on campus. To give you an example, the closest thing on campus would probably be like the butterfly room at the Ryman Garden, if anyone's ever been there. So they don't let you leave until you're in this one location, and it's double checking that you don't have any butterflies alongside you as you go. It's not quite the same thing. They're not really physically preventing you from leaving, but it's the same idea that you have to first get access to get into this room, and then someone else, usually a separate person, provides you access to get through the other side of that door. So two sets of locking doors. That's a somewhat awkward term. It's called a man trap. And then you have all the other aspects, right? You have your video cameras, your badges, your guards, your other kind of personnel management systems. In modern facilities, there's this concern about actual vehicles crashing in. So whenever you see those concrete or metal bollards, that's what that's essentially intended for. You see this outside of what others seems to be like a nondescript building as you're in some city center. That's probably the reason for it, that it's actually at the very least some sort of data center. and you put those concrete bollards because you have some at least small concern that people are going to potentially drive and break into the facility that way. And it doesn't seem like much, but if you ever look at a video of even a large truck driving into one of those things, they're actually quite impressive. If they're designed correctly, that can stop all sorts of momentum. But then locks themselves become an important consideration as well. You have your front door, you have your door to the server room, you then have some version of a lock to access that resource. And I think for the most part, until we consider it in this context, when we oftentimes think of a lock, we think of a padlock or some sort of cylindrical lock. A lock and key is what we typically, I think, by default think of. But locks come in many different forms and form factors. You have your padlocks, your combination locks, some versions of biometric locks, keypad locks. You also have your RSA, security tokens, which not exactly a lock. It's meant to be part of that multi-factor authentication. It has some sort of predetermined algorithm to kind of generate the second part of a combination, either for a login or for some sort of combination lock in your system. And then you have basic other locks like either magnetic strips or RFID locks. The physical locking mechanism tends to be pretty much the same concept. You have some sort of deadbolt or combination of usually piece of metal that's preventing the door from being physically opened, and you have some mechanism by which that deadbolt can be turned, right? That mechanism can then be opened up physically, and there is something that's preventing that from happening physically until some knowledge has been passed or until something else is physically present with you. So we can talk about the padlock, and it's not so different from the other locks in terms of what's ultimately happening. But locks are one of those things that look more secure than they actually are in practice. So for padlocks, they can be picked. It's not something that can be instantly learned, but it's just a skill like anything else that one can pick up here. There's all sorts of ways to break into combination locks. Keypad locks or number keypad locks themselves are very vulnerable. We have some of these still on campus. You can see specifically which numbers have been pressed hundreds and thousands of times and which numbers have been pressed hardly at all. If you have any sort of RFID lock, those tend to be pretty easy to clone because there's a code that has to be effectively broadcast by that RFID here. And this is a good quote from a pretty famous fantasy author. A lock does more than keep an honest person honest. I think that's probably true. From our perspective, maybe a better way to think about it would be a lock can only be one component of your physical security posture, right? You can have locks. It keeps people from just trying the door and seeing what they can access to. You generally can have them, but then not assume that your lock is going to be sufficient to keep people out. So some of those other mechanisms may also be important. Actual guards, actual surveillance, things like man traps and the like, beyond just the lock itself to keep people out. So let's talk a little bit about them. About these cylinder locks or these padlocks, because a majority of the locks I think that you would encounter in a typical door to a server room or a front door are of that style that's kind of pictured here, right? These cylinder locks. As a key is inserted into the keyhole, you have these pins, and that's what this visualization is trying to show here. This is sort of the red and blue being shown here. They're pressed upon by that key, and then there's actual physical springs that are in turn being compressed upon by those particular pins. If the correct key is put in place, each of those springs compressed just enough to allow sort of the yellow and red portions of the cylinder to line up perfectly, which allows for what's referred to as sort of the shear line to be engaged and allows for the lock itself to be turned and open. I have an example of a lock here. I don't know how well this is going to work in terms of seeing it live. We can give it a try. If it doesn't work, so be it. We can kind of just do it in different ways as well. So here's an example that's meant for illustrative and sort of learning purposes here. So the first thing you will notice when you take a look at it, you're gonna have to bear with me to see if we can get this technology to work in our favor here. is that it's transparent, right? And your locks will generally not be transparent. And this is a random product from a company that sells various levels of difficulty of locks and lock picking. I'm not here to challenge us with various lock picking exercises, but in terms of showing what a lock does, right, we can look at the screen. Let's go back here. Or we can look at the physical thing, and they're meant to be the same concept here. So here you can actually see if I can get this. Got to kind of look at two things here to get this to autofocus. So just give me a moment here. See the actual cylinder and the cam where the key would be entered. You then can see the physical springs. It's quite a zoom in here. The physical springs and the individual tumblers here, and where those pins are going to be pushed up to the springs to allow it to open. We may be able to see it a little bit better if we actually just put in a key, which I believe I brought. So you have your key, right? And your key itself has those various bumps. Those look kind of arbitrary, but they're particular to one specific lock, right? Or series of locks in which the bumps on this key are meant to align perfectly with where those particular pins are situated in the lock, such that you can actually probably see that this key is going to work as soon as we open it here, as soon as we push it in here. Let me show you that again. Those are those little bronze things near the bottom of the screen here are at various heights to begin with. And then the bumps in the key are of the exact right height such that they push up all those pins to that same exact location. And that's not an arbitrary location. What you can easily see here is that they're pushed up just enough so that there's kind of a gap now. And that gap is what allows this cylinder to then turn and is what allows our key to open here, right? You have a spring that's pushing against the actual locking mechanism here. You have these tiny springs here that are basically what is holding those pins in place. And only when we put in a key for which we are matching the exact pins and the exact height of those pins are we then able to open up a key. You'll take my word for it, if I put in a different key, the pins would be of a different height, wouldn't allow this lock to open. Okay, so maybe you're saying, oh, right, we know how to use a lock, or at least most of us do. We're able to access our keys here. Let's make sure if I'm doing this correctly. Okay. It's kind of our visualization of what's exactly happening here, right? If we didn't have a key, and we could actually see this if we were to put some little tool in there, you can still turn the cylinder somewhat, right? There's still some mechanisms associated with it, but as part of the pin, you have this component that's effectively blocking it from turning. It's a physical mechanism preventing that from turning. Only when that pin is pushed up such that the spring is pushing back just enough so that it's leaving effectively that shear, that gap there, that is what allows our cylinder to turn, what allows our lock to open here. So that is with the key. Obviously, if you have the key, you don't need to pick the lock. What we would then need if our goal was to then open the lock without having the key is a bench of effectively some facsimile of both those mechanisms. Some mechanism that allows that cylinder to turn, and some mechanism that allows us to basically push up those individual pins so that they're high enough to allow it to open here. And that's what any lock picking set worth its weight would provide for you. You have some number of different wrenches that allow the thing to turn. I have large hands, so I like the smallest wrench possible. It's just a little piece of flat thing that's just meaning to be jammed in there to allow it to turn, as well as one of many different types of pickers here that allow you to basically simulate the bumps on a particular key. Now, it's not meant to replace the key, and I think once you see that, you'll get the feel for what this is all about, right? This could be thought of as a key, right? It has bumps in a particular pattern, and if we hold it up next to the actual key for that lock, you can kind of see what I'm referring to here, right? The key has bumps. The key's a little worn down, but the key has bumps. The lock has bumps, but it's not meant to replace the key. It's not the same bump pattern here. For the key to work, the entire thing has to go in. It has to fit exactly right at one time, and that's how we get this lock to open here. Now, for our lock picking approach to work, we basically need both of those mechanisms. And I don't know if I'm using the exact right technical terms here to refer to what it is in practice. We need some mechanism to physically turn the cylinder. That's all this is. So this is just a flat edge here. There's a whole bunch of them in this box. You could use any of them. Just kind of putting that in there. And I guess as I'm trying this out, I'm kind of applying a little bit of pressure. That's what I'm doing. So I'm basically turning the cylinder, and it does give, right? As we said, even with the wrong key, depending on how strong or how busted the lock is and how many times people have attempted to pick it, it gives a little bit or a lot here. Let's go back to the slide example. You're going to insert the tension wrench into that hole. You're applying that torque. That's what I was doing there. It's creating that shelf that's going to allow those pins to in turn to rest upon. We then insert the pick, and for want of a better way to explain what you're doing, you're basically searching to find pins that are going to fall into place. And we don't actually know, unless we've looked at a particular lock before, which pins are the ones we're going to want to set in which order. To the extent you can hear a click or which you can kind of feel it falling into place. This is a very entry-level lock. I'll pass it around when we're done here, and I bet a bunch of you can get it working right away here today. A real lock or a lock in which we can't physically see what's happening as we're working on it would be a lot harder to do, but it's the same concept. You either hear it kind of setting in place, or you can also kind of feel it. You'll feel the cylinder give just a little bit more as you set each individual pin, and this nice little GIF kind of visually shows what's happening here. So we're putting the wrench, we are turning it. It turns out, due to some sort of imperfections with how it's manufactured, one of these pins is more likely to get set before the other one's in place. As we're turning this clockwise, one of those pins and the hole, the shaft that it's located in, is going to be located maybe more to the left than the other ones relative to each other. We try, basically trial and error, we try. As we apply that tension, it's effectively set. Then one other pin is going to be the next most easily able to be set here. There's no guarantee of the order. With the pick that we're using, you can get pretty far just kind of trying a few different things and seeing what happens. And eventually, though, as we try all the other ones and we kind of keep that tension applied, these pins are being held in place. We eventually get all 4, all 5, all however many there are set in place. When they're all set, then you can actually turn the tension wrench the rest of the way, and the whole lock will just kind of pop open. Again, why that works in practice is because, for the most part, there's subtle imperfections with how such a thing winds up being manufactured. Doesn't need to be, some visually different type of layout is being shown here. I don't think it's something that when one looks at it, you can really see it necessarily. You can also see just after a period of time, there just can be wear and sort of erosion on those individual shafts here. And so because of that, by moving from pin to pin and trying to work on the pins that are going to bind first, you're going to get those effectively stuck in place. You're going to get those so that they've been moved up high enough. The rest of them can still move freely. That pin is then taken care of. You just get each pin done on a pin-to-pin basis here. I would say it depends more on feel. Also, sound is the other consideration here. Now, I debated whether I was going to try to do this live in class and how much, embarrassment I wanted to undergo here. But today's a short lecture, so what we can do is I'll try it, and then you can all have your laugh, and then you all get to try it as well and see how easy you find it to be. This one should be okay. Again, our advantages are kind of threefold here. One, this is a lock designed to learn how to lock pick. Yeah. So that's a pretty big advantage. Two, it's transparent, right? You can kind of see as you're making progress or not. You don't have to blindly do it. We can apply a little cover to it if you don't want to see what you're doing, if you find it too easy. And three, we're using this pick that allows us to not be too precise, as opposed to trying to find each individual pin on a one-by-one basis and making sure we do it exactly right and not having to start over. As you'll see here, I'm just going to kind of give it a wild go and see what happens here. But what I should have done is tried this before class today to confirm I could actually do it. So I'm just kind of raking it across, and I don't know how well you can see it. And this could be something that, you look at the video afterwards as opposed to trying to look at this live on the screen here. There we go. So, no applause or anything. Okay, thank you. Now, having said that, I want you guys to try it. All right, I'm going to pass this around. Don't lose this for me. Just 3 little pieces, and I'll send another one down the other way here, and I'll go back to the video slide here. Basically, this illustration is probably your best bet for what you're trying to do. I have a couple of them that are part of this kit here. Don't feel bad if you can't get it. That one especially, though, I've messed around with a little bit over the years, and so you can have relatively easy access to it. This combination here, let me get a couple more pieces out, should also work, and I'll send that down. And since our class is relatively short today, I think it's worth trying at least once. Give yourself a couple minutes. If you get frustrated, stop doing it. Sounds good. I'm hearing something promising over there. Wasn't bad at all. Let me just make sure that this would actually work for you before I give it to people to try. No, this one is kind of wonky. I don't want you to break that piece. 1 second. Let me find a stronger one. Then I'll have you give it a go. And once you have it turned, you're free to go today. Because what we're going to do is we're going to leave this topic here for now. Okay, so this one should work, but it's not as easy as the other one. So we'll go one by one with just that particular lock. This one's definitely a little bit trickier because I don't have as good of a rake to apply to it. Let me see if I have something else in the kit here that'll work better. Here we go. Just don't want to lose any of these pieces. It wasn't that hard, was it? You got it working right away. Okay, these two, and we'll give you an extra rake just in case the first one you're finding difficult. These two should also work. So I will not keep you trapped here, but we have time remaining. So here's 4 pieces I'm passing over to you, and you work it backwards. How about that? No pressure, though. In terms of topic, that's pretty much all I wanted to cover today. Our next topic is going to be social engineering. We're kind of doing this in this lab environment, which is going to feel a little inauthentic in lab. There's only so much you can really do when you're targeting yourself for a sort of a social engineering attack. So take it at face value, learn a couple of the tools associated with that, and don't overthink it too much with regards to this lab. Don't forget Thursday will be our next quiz, of course, and then as we jump into this topic, we're going to get to move into totally different topics at that point. So leave things right here for today. If you can, stick around. Let's try to pick some locks together, but I'll stop the recording right now.